I want to begin with a pretty extraordinary fact, which is it is well over 20 years since a Prime Minister made a speech solely about prisons. To be frank, it can sometimes be easy for politicians to worry so much that their words will be caricatured that they might just as well avoid this whole area. And it can be easy for us all when these buildings we're talking about, prisons, are closed off by high walls and barbed wire, to adopt a sort of out of sight, out of mind attitude. Well, I want this government to be different. When I say we will tackle our deepest social problems and extend life chances, I want there to be no no-go areas. And that must include the 121 prisons in our country, where our social problems are most acute and people's life chances are most absent. So today I want to explain why I believe prison reform should be a great progressive cause in British politics, and to set out my vision for a modern, more effective, truly 21st century prison system. Now my starting point is this: we need prisons. Some people, including of course rapists, murderers, child abusers, gang leaders, belong in prisons. For me, punishment, the deprivation of liberty, is not a dirty word. I want us never to forget that it is the victims of crime who should always be our principal priority. And I'm not unrealistic or starry-eyed about what prison can achieve. Not everyone shows remorse, and not everyone seeks redemption. But I also strongly believe that we must offer chances to change, that for those trying hard to turn themselves around, we should offer hope. That in a compassionate country, we should help those who've made mistakes to find their way back onto the right path. In short, we need a prison system that doesn't see prisoners simply as liabilities to be managed, but instead potential assets to be harnessed. But the failure of our system today is scandalous. 46% of all prisoners will reoffend within a year of release. 60% of short sentence prisoners will reoffend within the same period. And current levels of prison violence, drug taking, and self-harm should shame us all. In a typical week, there will be almost 600 incidents of self-harm, at least one suicide, and 350 assaults, including 90 on staff. Now, this failure really matters. It matters to the public purse. This cycle of reoffending costs up to £13 billion a year. It matters to you, because in the end, who are the victims of this reoffending? It's the mother who gets burgled or the young boy who gets mugged. It matters to the prison staff, some of the most deeply committed public servants in our country, who have to work in dangerous and often intimidating circumstances. And yes, it matters to the prisoners themselves, who mustn't feel that society has totally given up on them. So I'm clear we need wholesale reform. And I'm convinced that with the right agenda, we can be world leaders in change. Just like we have been in welfare, just like in education, we can demonstrate that with the right reforms, we can make a lasting difference to people in our society. Now that begins with resetting the terms of the debate, especially when there are unhelpful but well-worn mantras that I think hold progress back. For years, education was held back by the soft bigotry of low expectations, the idea that the most disadvantaged children shouldn't be expected to achieve the best results. Likewise, police reform was partly set back by the false notion that the number of officers you had mattered more than how smartly they were actually deployed. Welfare reform, that was set back by the lazy idea that fairness could be judged by the size of the cheque you write rather than the chances that you offer. One by one, this government, we've taken on these arguments and we've created the platform for reform. Now today, we need to do the same with prisons. And I think there are three views that have held back progress. And together they've helped produce the rather sterile lock 'em up or let 'em out debate that I think has got in the way of real change. Now the first mantra is the idea that prisons are packed to the rafters with people who don't deserve to be there. This is not wholly untrue. There's a strong case for severely mentally ill or women with small children to be dealt with in a different way. But this position of some, mostly on the left, that we could somehow release tens of thousands of prisoners with no adverse consequences, it is, frankly, nonsense. It's simply not borne out by the evidence. Prisons are not full of offenders sentenced for drug possession, licence fee evasion, or petty victimless crime. It's actually pretty hard to get into prison in the first place. Here are the facts. Only 7% of prisoners are sentenced to custody for a first offence, and these will inevitably have been pretty serious crimes. 70% of prisoners have at least 7 previous offences, and the average prisoner has 16 previous convictions. So you won't hear me arguing to neuter judges' sentencing powers or reduce their ability to use prison when it is required. Of course, there's one group I do want out of prison much more quickly, instead of British taxpayers forking out for their bed and breakfast, and that is foreign national offenders. One of the big barriers here is we don't systematically record the nationality of offenders early enough, and this can hamper our ability to deport them. I know the frustrations of prison governors when they have to try and find out someone's nationality after they've already arrived in prison. So I can announce today that we'll now legislate to give the police new powers to require foreign nationals to hand over their passports and make them declare their nationality in court. Now, the second view that has held reform back is the idea that the only reliable way of cutting crime is to toughen sentencing and substantially increase the prison population. Now, again, there is some truth in this, and I know that incapacitation, prisoners being unable to threaten public safety while they're behind bars, that is absolutely vital. I've made this point myself about prolific burglars many times. That's why we've toughened sentencing, including for the most serious violent and sexual offenders, and rightly so. But I think politicians from all sides of the political spectrum are starting to realise the diminishing returns from ever higher levels of incarceration. For a start, under this government, we've already cut crime by around 25% in the last 5 years, while keeping the prison population largely flat. And the truth is that simply warehousing ever more prisoners is not financially sustainable, nor is it necessarily the most cost-effective way of cutting crime. Worse than that, it lets the other parts of the criminal justice system that are failing off the hook. It distracts us from the job of making prisons work better, and it fuels prison overcrowding, which hampers efforts to rehabilitate offenders, and that just makes us all less safe. So the question must be, wouldn't we be better to focus our scarce resources on preventing crime in the first place and by breaking the cycle of reoffending? Now, the third view that's held back reform is the one that says prisons are too soft, that they're a holiday camp, and we should make them harsher to provide more of a deterrent. Now, I get hugely frustrated when I see poor security that, for example, means prisoners able to access Facebook, or prisons that appear to be awash with alcohol and drugs. We are taking more action on drugs, corruption, and mobile phones. We've legislated to criminalise possession of so-called legal highs in prison. We're developing a new corruption prevention strategy to deal with the small number of corrupt staff who allow contraband in our prisons. And I can announce today that we're going to work with the mobile network operators to challenge them to do more, including developing new technological solutions so we can block mobile phone signals in prisons. But do you know what? Prisons aren't a holiday camp, not really. They are often miserable, painful environments. Isolation, mental anguish, idleness, bullying, self-harm, violence, suicide. These aren't happy places. It is lazy to subscribe to the idea that prisoners are somehow having the time of their lives. These establishments are full of damaged individuals, and here's the point: 99% of them will be released one day back into our communities. So we should ask ourselves, is it a sensible strategy to allow these environments to become twisted into places that just compound the damage and make people worse? Or should we be making sure that prisons are demanding places of positivity and reform so that we can maximize the chances of people going straight when they come out? Think about it this way: being tough on criminals is not always the same thing as being tough on crime. So we need a new approach, one that doesn't waste too much energy discussing big existential questions about the prison population, or traps us into often false choices between so-called tough or soft approaches. We've got to move on and develop a sensible plan for prison reform that will deliver better outcomes, improve public safety, and lower costs for the taxpayer. And I think Michael Gove is just the man for the job. And I want to thank Ken Clarke and Chris Grayling for the good start we made in this area in government, and Nick Herbert for changing our party's approach on prisons in opposition. In reforming prisons, we need to look, I think, no further than the approach we've taken in reforming other public services. Our reforms have followed some general rules. 1, give much greater autonomy to the professionals who work in our public services and allow new providers and new ideas to flourish. This is how you institute a culture of excellence, empowering staff as well as charities and businesses to innovate and try new things. It's exactly what we did in education, with academies, free schools, and new freedoms for heads and teachers. 2, hold these providers and professionals to account with real transparency over outcomes. Just as we've done in education and policing, we need better data to allow meaningful comparisons to be made between different prisons, so the best performing institutions and the best performing leaders can be recognised and rewarded. 3, intervene decisively and dramatically to deal with persistent failure or to fix the underlying problems that people may have. This is the lesson from our Troubled Families programme. We know piecemeal, fragmented solutions don't work. Instead, you need to show how an individual's problems are linked together and intervene in the right way. So while we've got the opportunity that prison presents, we need to be far better at dealing with and addressing prisoners' illiteracy, addiction, and mental health problems. 4, use the latest behavioural insights, evidence, and harness new technology to deliver better outcomes. Now, we've done this in welfare, for instance, through the introduction of greater conditionality, meaning that those who are out of work must show they're taking meaningful steps to find employment in return for getting their benefits. And the number of workless households has fallen by an incredible 480,000 since 2010. So by applying these principles, I believe we really can deliver a modern, more effective prison system that has a far better chance of turning prisoners into productive members of society. So let me explain more what we'll do in each area. Now, the first part of our strategy is to put professionals in the lead and to remove the bureaucratic micromanagement that disempowers them. The prison system today is incredibly and almost uniquely centralised. Think about this and think about it from the perspective of the boss of a prison, the prison governor. 924 prison service instructions and prison service orders are currently in operation. These documents, issued from headquarters to prescribe the running of our prisons, and together they amount to an incredible 46,000 pages of rules, regulations, and guidance. Now, of course, some of this will be necessary. I accept that. Prisons need rules. But we've reached the point where someone in Whitehall is sitting around deciding how many jigsaws a prisoner should be able to keep in their cell, how many sheets of music they can have in their possession, 12 in case you were wondering, and even how many pairs of underpants they're allowed. Think about the kind of morale-sapping, initiative-destroying culture this can create in an organisation. Want to try something new? Ask head office. Think you found a better way of organising things? Back in your box. Looking for motivation and inspiration on a Monday morning? Go and look elsewhere. The prison governor I spent some time with this morning made exactly this point to me. He said in order to do the things he needs to do, to get businesses into prison, to get workshops going, to form commercial partnerships, he says often I have to break the rules. This is obviously the wrong approach. Prisons are often accused of infantilizing the prisoners, but we're actually infantilizing the staff. Now, this is one of the toughest environments we ask people to work in. And I want the leadership team of a prison to be highly motivated, to be entrepreneurial, and to be fired up about their work. To be a team who don't ask permission from the centre every time, but are just empowered to get on and try something new. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to bring the academies model that has revolutionised our schools to the prison system. We're going to give prison governors unprecedented operational and financial autonomy and be trusted to get on and run their jail in the way they see fit. They'll be given a budget and total discretion over how to spend it. So, for example, they'll also be able to opt out of national contracts and choose their own suppliers. Instead of being prevented from transferring money between different pots, they can decide what they want to focus resources on. And they'll also be able to tailor their own regimes, including the amount of time spent out of cell doing purposeful activity. I can announce today that we will create 6 such reform prisons this year, run by some of the most innovative governors from across the prison estate. We'll follow this with a prisons bill in the next session that will spread these principles across the rest of the prison system. And because we know that state monopolies are often very slow to change themselves, because the involvement of the private and voluntary sectors in prisons has been one of the most important drivers of change in this system since the 1990s, we'll ensure there's a strong role for businesses and charities in the operation of these reform prisons and the new prisons that we will build during this Parliament. Now, together, this will amount to the biggest shake-up in the way our prisons are run since Victorian times. And we'll adopt the same principle in youth justice too. As Charlie Taylor's interim review will recommend tomorrow, we'll explore using the new free school process to set up secure alternative provision academies. In short, this will mean turning existing young offender institutions into what will effectively be high-quality schools that will demand the highest standards. And we want to attract the best talent into our prisons. I want us to make it even more aspirational for people to work in a prison and to want to run a prison. So just as we've done with the police, we're going to put rocket boosters under direct entry and fast-track schemes to attract the very best into managing the prison system so that it can benefit from greater diversity, from fresh ideas, and from new leadership. Now, with freedom and autonomy must come accountability. And that's why the second part of our plan must be to improve transparency. Here are some questions for you. What is the best performing prison in the country? Which is the prison that's achieving the best reoffending results? Which is the prison where offenders get the best qualifications to help them get a job when they're released? The answer is, we don't know. Seriously, we have no idea. And this just isn't good enough. Any modern public service has to be able to demonstrate its value. It's how you can make meaningful comparisons between different services, but most of all, it's how the people working inside the system can find out what's working and what isn't working, and then adapt accordingly. It can incentivize more of the projects I saw this morning, like the Halfords Academy that's getting people the skills they need to find work. So I can announce today we'll now develop meaningful metrics about prison performance. We'll measure the things that really count: reoffending levels compared to a predicted rate, employment outcomes for prisoners, whether or not the prisoner went into permanent accommodation, and what progress was made on basic literacy and key skills. And I can also announce we'll not only publish this data, we will develop new prison league tables that will allow us to easily compare different institutions. Now, this transparency isn't just a very powerful way to drive culture change. It also allows the government to hold those working in the system more easily to account. Using this information, we can use other tools, like payment for performance, to drive further improvements. It's working in academies, it's working in troubled families, it's working in the civil service. So I can announce today we'll work with prison staff to examine a new financial incentive scheme to reward staff in the best performing prisons. Now, by introducing autonomy and transparency, we can get the structures right to improve outcomes. But we often need more direct and joined up intervention to help turn people's lives around. Consider these facts. 24% of those in prison have been in care as a child, a quarter. 49% have an identifiable mental health problem, nearly half. 47%, almost half, have no qualifications whatsoever. And of course, behind these numbers, we have human beings. Children who felt the raw pain of abandonment at a young age, pain that never goes away. Young people who were abused physically by those who they should have trusted most, with violence and fear often devastating the sanctuary of home. Kids who never had proper discipline, so never learnt the virtues of delayed gratification or impulse control. Arriving at school already far behind, and the frustrations of illiteracy or maybe dyslexia leading to bravado, misbehavior, and exclusion. Exposed to alcohol and drugs too young in life, kicked out of the house as a teenager, learning to survive on the streets. I spoke last month about extending life chances, but we have to recognize that the prison population draws mostly from the ranks of those whose life chances were shot to pieces from the start. That doesn't excuse where they ended up, and nor does it say anything about the anguish that they caused their victims. But it does, I believe, help to explain what has happened. Now, this is important. Cutting reoffending is just a pipe dream unless we truly understand the turmoil and the trauma that define the lives of so many who've ended up in prison. Now, this is a golden opportunity to correct some earlier, often catastrophic, state failure. I want prisons to be places of care, not just punishment, where the environment is one conducive to rehabilitation and mending lives. That's why I'm so passionate about building these new prisons. It's frankly a disgrace that for so long we've been cramming people into aging, ineffective prisons that are creaking, leaking, and coming apart at the seams. These are places that were barely fit for human habitation when they were built, and are much, much worse today. They design in almost bullying, intimidation, and violence. As one staff member told the Chief Inspector of Prisons last year, "I wouldn't keep a dog in there." So I'm proud that this government has made a £1.3 billion commitment to knock many of these prisons down and to build 9 new ones, including 5 during this Parliament. As policy exchange work has shown, these new prisons can be far more effective at rehabilitating offenders with modern facilities, smart use of technology, such as biometric key systems. But it isn't just about new buildings, it's about what goes on inside them. And here we've got to think afresh about prison education. Over 50% of prisoners have the English and math skills of a primary school child. Many have learning difficulties, but at the moment governors have almost no control over who their education provider is or what is taught. We've only got 4 organisations nationally who provide education in prisons, and the way these services are organised is not producing anything like the results that we need. We're focusing too much on the number of qualifications, regardless of their usefulness, and neglecting the basic literacy and good quality qualifications that are actually going to help these people to find work. Now that needs to change. Soon, Dame Sally Coates will publish her review of prison education. It will recommend giving control of education budgets to prison governors, letting them bring in new providers, whether further education colleges, academy chains, free schools, or other specialists. And I can announce today that we back that recommendation 100%. And we'll go further. I can announce we'll protect those budgets in cash terms with £130 million a year. I also want the best and brightest graduates to want to teach prisoners, even if it's just for a short period in their career. So just as we back programs which get graduates teaching in our worst schools or working in social services, I can announce that I've asked Brett Wigdorts, Chief Executive of Teach First, to advise on setting up a new social enterprise that will work to develop a similar scheme for prisons. And I'm pleased to say, and I'm sure Dean will welcome this, David Laws has agreed to chair the new organisation, which I think is going to be a very good partnership. Now next we've got to sort out mental health treatment and drug treatment. This is one area where I believe that as a country we do need to ask some very searching questions. There's been a failure of approach and a failure of public policy. In terms of approach, frankly, we're locking up some severely mentally ill people in prison who shouldn't be there. And that's why, as a matter of urgency, I've asked Michael Gove and Jeremy Hunt to look at what alternative provision can be made for more humane treatment and care. In terms of policy, I worry that at the moment the design of mental health treatment cuts out the governors and the staff. So I can announce that for mental health, we'll now move towards full co-commissioning for governors on the one hand and NHS England on the other, meaning that prison leaders can have much more say in defining the kind of services their prisoners need and how the available budget is used. This will begin in reform prisons and, if successful, will apply nationwide from 2017, underpinned by new legislation in our Prisons Bill. We'll also publish healthcare data on a prison-by-prison basis, so there's proper transparency about outcomes and performance. And we'll also move towards co-commissioning for drug treatment funding, so governors have more freedom to set up the therapeutic communities, the drug-free wings, the abstinence-based treatment programs that their offenders need. When it comes to turning prisoners' lives around, though, there is a new front that we need to open action on, and that is tackling extremism. We have around 1,000 prisoners who've been identified as extremist or vulnerable to extremism. And we know that through intimidation, violence, grooming, some of these individuals are preying on the weak, forcing conversions to Islam and spreading their warped view of the world. I understand not only what a problem this is causing for prison management, who are trying to deliver a safe environment, but it's also a huge danger and risk for public safety when these people are released. We will not stand by and watch people being radicalised like this while they're in the care of the state. So Michael Gove has commissioned a review of this issue, and I want to be clear, I'm prepared to consider major changes from the imams we allowed to teach in prison, to changing the locations and methods of dealing with prisoners convicted of terrorism offences if that is what is required. I look forward to the review's recommendations, but I can announce today two things we will definitely do. First, we'll develop a new prison-based programme for countering the non-violent extremism that can lead on to the terrorism and the violence. This will focus on those at risk of radicalisation, regardless of the crime they originally committed, as well as those convicted of terrorist offences. And to deal with the most serious cases, just as we introduce mandatory de-radicalisation programmes in the wider community, we'll also introduce these in our prisons. Now, everything I've spoken about today is what goes on in prison, but rehabilitation doesn't end at the prison gates. It's about what happens outside them as well. And that is why Chris Grayling began the Transforming Rehabilitation Programme, and it means that every prisoner now receives support and supervision on release. This was actually a huge landmark reform of the last Parliament, but very little remarked on. Basically means anyone coming out of prison, no matter how short their sentence, actually gets supervision and help. And I think they will make a real impact on reoffending and public safety. Now, outside prison, I believe we should be more creative and more open to the new thinking, the new technology, and the understanding from behavioural insights. For example, Judge Steve Alm in Hawaii, I think mentioned by Dean in his introduction, has been pioneering the idea of swift and certain sentencing to deal with drug offenders. So instead of just locking them up, they're randomly tested for drugs in the community on certain days of the week. If they test positively, they're instantly jailed for between 24 and 48 hours. And then they come back out and the process starts again. The results are fascinating. It's perhaps the most successful community sentence anywhere in the world. Massive reductions in drug use and rearrest rates. Perhaps more effective than even intensive drug treatments in terms of changing behaviour. Almost 20 US states have now adopted this model, as well as others like it, including drug courts and problem-solving courts that adopt a similar tough love approach. Why do these programs work? Well, I think it's quite simple. Because instead of an uncertain and often random sentence delivered months or sometimes even years after a crime is committed, this is far more instantaneous and far more demanding of the offender. And because punishment is less severe but more swift and more certain, it allows you to apply punishments far more frequently. More punishments delivered rapidly, a real meaningful deterrent. That is how to bring about lasting behavioural change. That's why I promised to introduce legislation for new swift and certain sentence was in our manifesto, and I can announce today that the Justice Secretary and the Lord Chief Justice have set up the first joint working group to examine how to deliver these sorts of problem-solving courts in England and Wales. We've also got to be much smarter about using new technology. We've already pledged to expand the use of alcohol monitoring tags, which enforce drinking bans for those offenders convicted of alcohol-related crimes. But there's also a huge opportunity presented by the new satellite tracking tags. Satellite tracking will be groundbreaking for the criminal justice system, meaning that the police and probation service can know where an offender is at all times. It means we can tightly manage and accurately track someone's movements, opening up radical new sentencing options. Satellite tracking tags could be used so that more prisoners go out to work in the day and return in the evening. They could help some offenders with a full-time job to keep it and just spend weekends in custody instead. This could revolutionise the way we release prisoners on licence at the end of a sentence and dramatically toughen up community sentences. Now, we've made too slow progress in getting this technology on stream, and I want us to go faster. So I can announce today that major new pilots will begin on satellite tracking later this year, and we'll have this technology rolled out right across the country before the end of the Parliament. I especially want to look at how we use these tags for female offenders. A sad but true fact is that last year there were 100 babies in our country living in a prison. Yes, actually inside the prison. in the prison's mother and baby unit, to be precise. Now, prison staff do their best to make these environments pleasant. Some units even have a special sensory room so that babies can see colours, sights and sounds, even parts of nature that they wouldn't otherwise see inside the grey walls of a jail. Now, I understand why this happens, but we should ask ourselves, is it right? When we know the importance of the early years for child development, how can we possibly justify having babies behind bars? There are actually women in these prisons who were born in the same prison 20 years earlier and that have ended up there later as criminals themselves. Think of the damage done to the life chances of these children. And I believe we've got to try and break this cycle. So I want us to find alternative ways of dealing with women offenders with babies, including through tagging, problem-solving courts, and alternative resettlement units. This is one other area where I want us to be bold and where we can use the latest thinking to make a difference, and that is to help prisoners find work on release. There's a simple problem today. Ex-offenders are often rejected for jobs outright because of their past. And I want us to build a country where the shame of prior convictions doesn't necessarily hold people back from working and providing for their families. Now, of course, I want businesses and organisations to know who they're interviewing. If a conviction is unspent, they need to know about it and make the right decision for them, for that business. But here's my question. Should offenders have to declare it up front, before the first sift of the CVs, before they've even been able to state their case? Or might this be done a bit later, at interview stage, or before an actual offer of work is made? Now, they've done this in America, and it's called Ban the Box. And I want to work with businesses, including the many who've already signed up to the Business in the Community campaign, to see if we can do this here. And because I believe in leading by example, I can announce today that every part of the civil service will be banning the box in these initial recruitment phases. So this is our agenda for a revolution in the prison system, all centred around those powerful public service reform principles. This will take time and a lot of hard work to deliver, just as in education and welfare. And I'm under no illusions. This is not going to be easy. This system will be hard to change because it is in some ways still stuck in the dark ages, old buildings, old thinking, old ways of doing things. But I don't want to go slow here. I want us to get on with proper, full-on prison reform. And the prize is big. If we get this right, we can begin to deliver the lower offending rates that will protect the poorest who so often bear the brunt of crime. If we get it right, we can change the culture so that our brilliant staff can be empowered to lead the world with new rehabilitation techniques and smarter ways of managing prisoners. If we get it right, we can change lives, improve public safety, and bring hope to those for whom it has been in short supply, turning waste and idleness into prisons with purpose, turning remorse and regret into lives with new meaning, finding diamonds in the rough and helping them shine. That is our mission, and we should get on with the work. Thank you.